Shalom and welcome to Messianic Mosaics. I'm Rabbi Michael Calise.
And I'm Rabbi Calise, and we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We'd like to encourage you to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel and share this with other people. Make comments or send us suggestions of topics you would like us to cover and any biblical questions you might have or related to Jewish identity and lifestyle. We are open to any ideas that you have that you would like us to talk about.
So, Carol, by the way, how you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Good. Well, it's always good to be doing good. Let me begin, though, with a question. It's a question that I think a lot of people ask. Matter of fact, we know they ask it because people often when they come to our congregation, they almost lead with this question. Maybe worded a little differently, but basically it's the same thing. So if the very first followers of Yeshua were Jewish and they celebrated Passover and the other biblical festivals, how did we get from Passover and something that was authentically Jewish to what most of the world celebrates as Easter and a very Gentilized form of the faith?
That's a great question, Michael, and you're right. We often get phone calls around Passover, Easter time with people asking us specifically, why are these two holidays not together this year? And I think most believers have never stopped to ask why the difference. We inherit traditions from the generations before us, and there's value in that. Everybody has traditions. We
Absolutely.
talked about that before. But every now and then it's healthy to step back and ask, well, how did we get here? And that's what we're going to explore over the next two episodes of our podcast.
Yeah, so today we're looking at one of the most significant and yet one of the least known controversies in the history of the early body of Messiah. It's called the Quartodeciman controversy. Now, don't let the name intimidate you, because once we explain what it means, you'll discover the issue itself is actually very straightforward. But the implications of that controversy were anything but simple.
Exactly, because what began as a disagreement over when to commemorate Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection eventually became part of a much larger story, a story about the identity, authority, tradition, and the growing separation between the followers of Yeshua and the Jewish foundations of their faith.
Yeah, so before we jump into we need to begin where the new covenant begins, and that's in the first century. So first century Jerusalem, think of that. And because if we don't understand what the earliest body of Messiah looked like, we really can't appreciate why this controversy became so significant in the first place.
So before we can understand what changed, we first have to understand where the story began. So imagine for a moment with me that you travel back to Jerusalem about 10 years after Yeshua's resurrection. The temple is still standing, the morning sacrifice has been offered, and pilgrims from throughout the land of Israel and from Jewish communities scattered across the Roman Empire have filled the streets of Jerusalem. You hear Hebrew and Aramaic alongside Greek and probably a little Latin at this point and other languages spoken by the Jews of the diaspora. And it's one of Adonai's appointed time. Jerusalem is alive with worshipers who have come to celebrate just as the Torah commanded. Now you look around. Do you see any churches on the street corners? Do you find believers calling themselves Christians? Has Passover been replaced by Easter? Not at all. What you find is something unmistakably Jewish. Right in the middle of Jewish life is the growing body of Messiah.
And that's one of the biggest misconceptions people have about the first century. Many assume that after Yeshua's resurrection, everything changed overnight, that somehow Judaism ended and Christianity immediately began. But when you actually read the book of Acts, that's simply not the picture that Luke gives us. Matter of fact, the outpouring of the Ruach HaKodesh in Acts chapter 2 took place on Shavuot, one of Adonai's appointed times listed in Leviticus 23. The very birth of the body of Messiah happened on a biblical feast day.
And it's worth asking, why were so many people in Jerusalem that day? Luke tells us that there were Jews from every nation under heaven. They hadn't gathered to celebrate something new. They were there because the Torah required Jewish men to appear before Adonai for the pilgrimage festivals. For centuries, Shavuot had brought Jewish people from throughout the diaspora back to Jerusalem. And on that very day, Adonai poured out his Spirit. This wasn't an accident of history. It was the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan and the promise that he had made through the prophet Joel and other prophets.
So Luke goes on to tell us that these new believers devoted themselves to the teaching of the Shaliachim, the apostles, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. Then in Acts chapter 2, verse 46, he adds an important detail that sometimes is overlooked, and probably for cultural reasons. It says, day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple. Carol, notice where they were. They were in the temple in Jerusalem, not because they hadn't yet understood the new covenant, but because they were Jewish believers worshiping the God of Israel and proclaiming the messiahship of Yeshua in a thoroughly Jewish context.
And that pattern continues, Michael. As we read through Acts, we see over and over again these Jewish believers continuing to worship in a Jewish context. Acts chapter 3 opens with Kepha, Peter, and Yochanan, John, going up to the temple. What does it say? At the hour of prayer. Obviously, that's one of my favorite stories in the book of Acts where the lame man is healed.
It's a good one.
It is a very good one. But the point here in the context of our podcast today is they were going up to the temple. They were believers in Yeshua at this point.
Absolutely.
They had experienced the outpouring of the Ruach HaKodesh, but they went at the appointed time of prayer. And then in Acts chapter 5, Luke tells us that they continued teaching every day in the temple and went from house to house. So the temple remained a central part of their lives, even as they proclaimed that Yeshua was the Messiah.
Yeah, and the same is true of Rav Shaul, or the Apostle Paul, as some may know him as. And although many people think Rav Shaul abandoned Judaism, the book of Acts paints a very different picture. In Acts 18 and again in Acts 20, he arranged his travels around the biblical festivals. Why? Because he wanted to be in Jerusalem for Shavuot. Then in Acts 21, he participated in the temple purification rites to demonstrate publicly that the accusations against him, and these were the accusations that he was teaching Jewish believers to forsake Moses. And to prove they were false, he did what the Shaliachim told him he should do.
In fact, when you read the dialogue between him and between Yaakov James, he says something very interesting to Rav Shaul. He says, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jewish people who have believed, and they are all zealous for the Torah. Think about that for a moment. This is decades after Yeshua's resurrection, and there were thousands of Jewish believers in Yeshua. And Luke specifically mentions that they remained zealous for the Torah. In other words, they were not giving up being Jewish. They were not giving up the Jewish practices that they had observed all their life. And that's probably very different from the picture that many believers have in their minds today. I know this because I have heard many believers speak, and when they read through the book of Acts, they constantly talk about the church, the church, the church. But there is no church. These are Jewish believers worshiping the Jewish Messiah in the Jewish cultural context of the day there in Jerusalem.
It really is, mind-blowing when you think about it. The first followers of Yeshua didn't believe they were exchanging one religion for another. They believed they had found the fulfillment of everything Moshe and the prophets and the writings had promised concerning Israel's Messiah. This was a natural fit. As a matter of fact, it would seem unnatural. Think about it for a second. Here you are, a Jewish person in the first century, waiting for centuries for the promised Messiah to come, right? So God gave a culture that included a promise of a coming Messiah from the Davidic line. And now that the Messiah finally comes, and God now says, okay, forget about everything I told you that led up to this point about being Jewish. and about the cultural expressions of being Jewish. And now we're going to totally remove all of that.
Yes.
Doesn't make sense.
It does not make sense. And when you continue to look throughout the New Covenant, you see Yeshua himself celebrated Passover with his disciples, went to synagogue regularly with them. The disciples celebrated Shavuot. Writing to the congregation in Corinth, Rav Shaul declares, Messiah, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the feast. In other words, we're not going to stop celebrating Passover.
Right.
He just explains that its fulfillment is in the Messiah, but we're going to keep celebrating it just as we do today.
Right.
Then in Romans 11, Rav Shaul uses a beautiful picture of the olive tree. And when he talks about the olive tree, he doesn't tell us that Gentile believers are replacing Israel, but as wild olive branches, they are grafted in to Israel's cultivated olive tree because of the grace and mercy of God. The root remains the same. The covenant remains the same. The promises remain the same. It's all Jewish, the context of it. And then in Ephesians 2, Rav Shaul tells the Gentile believers that through the Messiah, they have been brought near, that they were once strangers to the covenant of promise, but now they are fellow citizens with the members of the household of God, the Jewish members. And this language isn't a language of replacement. It's a language of inclusion. We are now bringing the Gentiles into this faith in the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we step back and look at the Brit Chadashah, or the New Covenant as a whole, the picture is remarkably clear. The earliest body of Messiah was thoroughly Jewish in its leadership, its worship, its scriptures, its calendar, and its understanding of the Messiah. Which brings us to the question that sets the stage for everything we're about to discuss. If that's where the story began, what happened? How did a movement that was born in Jerusalem, rooted in the Hebrew scriptures, and centered on Israel's Messiah gradually become disconnected from so much of its Jewish heritage?
And that's the journey, as you said, that we're going to begin exploring. And as we'll discover, the answers aren't found in the pages of the New Covenant, but they're found in the history that followed. So if the earliest body of Messiah was so thoroughly Jewish, Michael, something had to happen to change that picture. And it certainly didn't happen overnight.
No, it didn't. In fact, the transition took place over decades, and much of it was shaped by the dramatic events unfolding throughout the Jewish world. Remember, the first believers lived in a world where Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life. The temple stood on Mount Moriah. Pilgrims traveled there for the appointed festivals. The Shiliachim ministered from Jerusalem, and Jewish believers naturally looked to Jerusalem for leadership. But before the first century came to an end, that entire world was shaken to its core.
We all know that in 70 CE, after years of increasing tension and rebellion, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. The city was devastated, and the temple, which had been the heart of Jewish worship for centuries, was destroyed. Now, if you know the New Covenant, you know Yeshua had foretold that not one stone would be left upon another, and now his words had become a reality. And it's difficult for us to really appreciate the magnitude of that event because we've never known Judaism with a temple. But for the Jewish people of the first century, everything revolved around it. It was where the daily sacrifices were offered, where the priesthood ministered, where Israel gathered before Adonai during the appointed times, and where the presence of God was uniquely associated for all Jewish people, including those who believed in Yeshua the Messiah. And suddenly, it was all gone.
Let that soak, into your heart for a second. This wasn't simply the destruction of an important building.
Right.
It was the collapse of the center of Jewish national and religious life. The priesthood could no longer function as it had. The sacrificial system came to an end. Jerusalem lay in ruins, and Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire were left asking a very difficult question: how do we faithfully serve God without the temple? So that question shaped the future of Judaism. At about the same time, another transition was taking place within the body of Messiah. The generation that had walked with Yeshua was passing from the scene. Yaakov, James, the brother of the Lord, had already been martyred. Kepha and Shaul, or Peter and Paul, would also give their lives for the Besorah, the gospel. But by the close of the first century, only the Shaliach, the apostle John, remained. Before long, believers could no longer simply ask one of the Shaliachim to settle a difficult question. A new generation of leaders would now have to guide the growing and nascent body of Messiah.
And it really was the end of an era. In the years that followed, the center of Jewish religious life gradually shifted from the temple to the synagogue and the study of Torah. Under the leadership of sages such as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the academy at Yavna became an important center for preserving and organizing Jewish life after the destruction of the temple. Rabbinic Judaism, as it would later develop, began taking shape during this period. And at the same time, the Jewish believers in Yeshua were navigating many of these same historical realities. They too had lost the temple. They too were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Yet they also understood something unique, that Yeshua had spoken of these events and that his atoning sacrifice had accomplished what the temple sacrifices had always pointed towards.
Meanwhile, the good news continued spreading, just as we saw beginning in the book of Acts with Cornelius, Antioch, and the emissarial journeys of Rav Shaul. Increasing numbers of Gentiles were placing their faith in Israel's Messiah. Good thing. Congregations were being established throughout Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome itself. By the end of the first century, the body of Messiah looked very different than it had on the day of Shavuot in Acts chapter 2.
And that's a really important point. It's not that Jewish believers disappeared because they were still there, but as the gospel spread among the nation, Gentile believers began to outnumber Jewish believers. It's just a natural thing. Jewish people have always been a small percentage of the world population. So naturally, many of these new believers had not grown up observing the biblical feasts or living within the rhythms of Jewish life. They loved the God of Israel. They embraced the Hebrew scriptures and certainly embraced Yeshua as the Messiah, but their cultural background was different from that of the first generation of disciples that we read about in Acts 2 and throughout the book of Acts.
Then, just a few decades later, another event dramatically altered the landscape. In AD 132, Simon Bar Kokhba led a second major Jewish revolt against Rome. Many within the Jewish community believed he might be the Messiah who would restore Israel's independence. Jewish believers in Yeshua, however, could not support that claim because they knew the Messiah had already come. The revolt ended, Carol, in disaster, as we know.
Exactly, because when the Romans crushed the rebellion in 135 CE, the consequences were devastating. Emperor Adrian rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman city and prohibited Jews from living there. Even the province of Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, an apparent attempt to diminish its historic Jewish identity. And at this point, the Jerusalem congregation that had once served as the heart of the Messianic movement no longer occupied the same place of influence. So the center of gravity had shifted to congregations in places like Antioch, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Rome.
So one of those places, Ephesus, is especially important to our story. According to the testimony of the early believers, the Shaliach Yochanan, or John the Apostle, spent the closing years of his ministry there. Ephesus became one of the most influential centers of the body of Messiah, and the congregations throughout Asia Minor looked to Yochanan's leadership long after Jerusalem had lost its central role. That matters because the believers in Asia Minor would later insist that the way they observed Passover had not been invented by them. They believed it had been handed down from the Shaliach Yochanan himself and faithfully preserved by leaders who had known him personally. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating questions in early Messianic Jewish history.
Yes, who were these believers? Why were they so committed to celebrating Passover on the 14th day of Nisan? And why did that become such a significant issue? To answer those questions, we need to meet a group of believers known as the Quartodecimans. we've set the biblical stage. Jerusalem has been devastated. The temple has been destroyed. The body of Messiah is spread throughout the Roman Empire, and the center of influence has gradually shifted towards places like Asia Minor and Rome. So, Michael, why don't you tell us who exactly were these people?
So the name sounds much more complicated than it really is, like we alluded to before. The word Quartodeciman comes from the Latin word meaning 14th. It referred to believers who commemorated Messiah's death on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, the very day the Torah identifies as Passover. Leviticus 23:5 tells us, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is Adonai's Passover. At first glance, that doesn't sound controversial at all, quite frankly. After all, they're simply following the biblical calendar. So why did this become one of the most significant controversies in the history of the early body of Messiah? Because this wasn't merely a debate about dates. It was a debate about preserving what each side believed was the authentic tradition handed down by the Shaliachim, the apostles.
And Michael, that's an important distinction. It's not about a date. The Quartodecimans weren't trying to preserve Judaism simply for Judaism's sake. They really believed the Passover had reached its fulfillment in the Messiah, and that when Yeshua celebrated his final Passover with his disciples, he invested that meal with new covenant significance. The matzah and the cup pointed to his body and his blood, yet the setting remained Passover. So for these believers, observing the 14th of Nisan wasn't about clinging to old customs. It was about remembering the very evening on which Yeshua instituted the new covenant and gave himself as our Passover lamb. They believed that by keeping the biblical day, they were honoring the pattern established by Messiah himself and faithfully preserved by the disciples ahead of them.
Yeah. The strongest center of this practice was found in Asia Minor, in congregations such as Ephesus and Smyrna. As we mentioned in the previous section, these were the very regions associated with the ministry of the Shaliach Yochanan during the closing years of his life. That connection is extremely important because the believers in Asia Minor never argued that they had created a new tradition. They consistently maintained that they had received this practice directly from the Shaliachim. In their minds, this wasn't innovation, it was preservation.
And one of the most important figures in this discussion is Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna. Now, we use the word bishop. We shouldn't picture this highly developed church hierarchy that emerged century later. In the 2nd century, a bishop was essentially the recognized overseer of a local congregation or region. And that's important because we don't want to read back into history our modern understanding of words and terminology. So Polycarp wasn't simply another respected leader. According to the earliest historical testimony, he had himself been instructed by the disciple Yochanan and had known others who had personally walked with Yeshua. So that made him like a living bridge between the apostolic generation and the generation that followed. So think about that for a moment. Imagine hearing someone teach you who had personally learned from one of Yeshua's own disciples. So that's the kind of credibility Polycarp carried. Even those who later disagreed with him never questioned his character or his devotion to Messiah.
Yeah, Polycarp's life also demonstrated remarkable faithfulness. Around 155 AD, he was martyred rather than denying Messiah. According to the ancient account of his martyrdom, when he was urged to renounce Yeshua, he replied, and I quote, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Whether those words were preserved verbatim or faithfully summarized by those who recorded his death, they reveal the kind of man Polycarp was. He wasn't interested in defending personal opinions. He was committed to remaining faithful to what he believed he had received from the Shaliachim.
And a few decades later, another leader would emerge from Asia Minor to defend that same apostolic tradition, and his name was Polycrates, and he was a bishop of Ephesus. So when questions arose concerning the proper time for commemorating Messiah's death, Polycrates wrote one of the most significant surviving letters of the 2nd century. And what is fascinating is the way he makes his argument. He doesn't appeal to popularity. He doesn't appeal to convenience. He doesn't even appeal to regional custom. He appeals to the disciples, to the apostles.
Listen to the confidence with which Polycrates writes, and I quote, "We therefore observe the genuine day, neither adding thereto nor taking therefrom." He then explains why, and I quote, "For in Asia also great lights have fallen asleep, who shall rise again in the day of the Lord's coming. Philip, one of the 12 Shaliachim, Yochanan, who leaned upon the Lord's breast, Polycarp in Smyrna, Thracias, Segaris, Papirius, and Melito." And after listing these respected leaders, he reaches his conclusion, and I quote, "All these observed the 14th day of the Passover according to the gospel, deviating in no respect, but following the rule of faith." Those are remarkable words. Polycrates isn't arguing that this is simply the custom of Asia Minor. He is arguing that this is the practice handed down by the Shaliachim themselves.
And when he closes his letter, his words immediately remind us of what we read in Acts chapter 5. "I am not frightened by terrifying words, for those greater than I have said we ought to obey God rather than men." These aren't the words of someone defending personal preference again. They're the words of someone who sincerely believed he was standing in continuity with the apostles and preserving what they had entrusted to the next generation. So by the end of the 2nd century, the congregations of Asia Minor were convinced that they were faithfully guarding an apostolic tradition that stretched back to John, Philip, and the earliest followers of Yeshua. The question was, would the rest of the body of Messiah agree? Well, not everyone did. And one of the first major tests of this issue came when Polycarp traveled from Smyrna to Rome to meet with the bishop there.
As we've seen, the believers in Asia Minor were convinced they were preserving a practice that had been handed down by the Shaliachim themselves. They weren't claiming to have discovered something new. They believed they were faithfully guarding something actually very old. And for a number of years, believers who differed on this issue continued to recognize one another as brothers in Messiah. The disagreement was real, but the fellowship remained intact. One of the best examples of that spirit is found in the meeting between Polycarp of Smyrna, the bishop of Smyrna, and Anicetus, the bishop of Rome.
So sometime around the middle of the 2nd century, Polycarp traveled to Rome. And one of the primary reasons for his visit was to discuss the proper time for commemorating Messiah's death and resurrection. So he explained that he continued observing Passover on the 14th day of Nisan because that was the practice he had received from Yochanan and from those who had known the Lord. Anicetus, however, maintained the Roman custom of commemorating Messiah's resurrection should take place on Sunday. At the end of the discussion and the meeting, neither man had persuaded the other.
Right. So what makes this meeting so significant isn't simply that Polycarp and Anicetus disagreed. It's what Anicetus did despite that disagreement. According to Irenaeus, although Anicetus continued following the Roman practice, he recognized Polycarp as faithfully preserving the tradition he had received from the Shaliach Yochanan. Their differences did not prevent them from remaining in fellowship. And Anicetus even invited Polycarp to preside at the Lord's table. That tells us something really important and shouldn't be missed. In the middle of the 2nd century, the practice of observing Passover on the 14th day of Nisan was still recognized by many as a legitimate apostolic tradition within the wider body of Messiah.
But unfortunately, that acceptance would not last. About 40 years later, the tone of the discussions changed dramatically. What had once been recognized as a legitimate apostolic practice was now viewed by some as something that should be abandoned altogether. So the issue was no longer simply whether congregations could observe Passover differently. The question had become whether a distinctly Jewish expression of faith in Yeshua would continue to have its place within the growing body of Messiah. So for the first time, a practice that believers in Asia Minor believed they had received from Yochanan was no longer simply questioned, but it was being rejected.
Yeah.
Strongly rejected.
Yeah. And by the closing of the 2nd century, Victor had become Bishop of Rome. Unlike Anicetus, Victor believed the entire body of Messiah should observe one uniform practice. He insisted that congregations everywhere abandon the observance of Passover on the 14th day of Nisan and instead adopt the Roman custom of commemorating Messiah's resurrection on Sunday. So the churches of Asia Minor respectfully refused. They believed they had neither the right nor the authority to abandon a practice they had received from the Shaliachim.
And Polycrates was one who spoke on behalf of the congregations. And as we heard a few minutes ago, he reminded Victor of the long line of faithful leaders who had observed Passover on the biblical date and concluded by declaring he was not intimidated by their threats because, as he said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So these weren't the words of someone looking for a fight, but they were the words of someone convinced that he was remaining faithful to the teaching and practices of Yeshua and the first century disciples.
Yeah. So Victor's response was unprecedented. He attempted to cut off the congregations of Asia Minor from fellowship with the rest of the body of Messiah. In effect, congregations that traced their practice back to the Shaliach Yochanan were now facing excommunication because they refused to abandon the observance of Passover on the 14th day of Nisan. Whether one agrees with Victor's decision or not, this marked a significant turning point in history, I should say, of the body of Messiah.
But his actions didn't go unchallenged. One of the most respected leaders of the day was Irenaeus, who was the Bishop of Lyons. And interestingly, he himself had been also a disciple of Polycarp, which placed him only one generation removed from Yochanan.
Right.
Although he personally observed the Sunday celebration, he believed that Victor had gone too far. So he appealed to him not to sever fellowship over a matter on which earlier generations had peacefully disagreed. He reminded Victor of the relationship between Polycarp and Anicetus, pointing out that although they followed different practices, they remain united in the Messiah.
Yeah. And history doesn't record every detail of Victor's, response, but it does tell us something really important. The Quartodeciman practice did not disappear. Many congregations throughout Asia Minor continued observing Passover on the 14th day of Nisan for years afterward. The controversy was far from over. In fact, it would continue into the 4th century before finally being addressed by the Council of Nicaea.
So, Michael, after everything we've explored today, I think one question naturally rises to the surface. Was this really just a disagreement over a date on the calendar? I mean, on the surface, that's what it appears to be about. One group says, let's observe on the 14th day of Nisan. Another prefers Sunday. So isn't this just about a date?
Yeah, that's a fair question because history is filled with disagreements. We know that over customs and traditions, certainly, especially in the Jewish sector, right? We're familiar with that. Most of them never reach the point of threatening congregations with excommunication, yet this one did. Why? What made this issue so significant? Why were the believers in Asia Minor willing to stand their ground so firmly? And why was the congregation in Rome equally determined that the practice should change? Those aren't easy questions, and they deserve truly careful and thoughtful answers.
And we're going to continue to look at that in episode 2. But throughout this episode, we've heard repeated appeals to apostolic authority. The believers in Asia Minor pointed to Yochanan. They pointed to Philip. They pointed to Polycarp. They pointed to a long line of faithful leaders who believed that they had carefully preserved what the apostles, disciples, and Yeshua themselves had practiced. Rome appealed to uniformity and unity within the growing body of Messiah. And everyone believed they were defending something important. The question is what?
Right. As we look back in history, we have to be careful not to read later events back into earlier centuries. We also have to resist the temptation to oversimplify what happened. Rarely does a single event explain a major historical shift. More often, history unfolds gradually as cultural, political, and theological influences begin shaping the decisions people make over time. That's the way it happens. So rather than rushing to conclusions, let's continue allowing the historical evidence to speak for itself.
So in our next episode next week, we're going to continue to examine the writings of some of the most influential leaders of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, where this sort of comes to a culmination. We're going to hear the voices of authors like Justin Martyr, Melito of Sardis, Tertullian. We're going to read part of the Epistle of Barnabas. And eventually we're going to come to Constantine the Great. So rather than telling you what to think, we're going to ask, what did these men actually say? We're going to read their own words. We'll consider whether a gradual separation from the Jewish roots of faith was already taking place, and whether that separation influenced the way Passover and eventually other distinctly Jewish expressions of faith in Yeshua came to be viewed.
Yeah, our purpose, by the way, isn't to criticize the past or assign blame. Our purpose is to understand history honestly and carefully. Because when we understand where we've been, we're better equipped to appreciate the rich Jewish foundation upon which our faith in Yeshua rests. Simple. So, again, we want to thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Messianic Mosaics. We hope you'll join us next time as we continue exploring this remarkable journey and ask an important question. How did the Jewish expression of faith in Yeshua gradually become separated from the very movement in which it was born? So I hope that whet your appetite for part 2 of this. Please give us a like, subscribe, hit the bell notification, and comment down below. We really appreciate your listening and taking the time to be with us. So thank you so much, and shalom, shalom.
Have a good week.